In this lesson, we'll edit the flattened section and change the line thicknesses where required by changing the color of the lines. Now, when we have a look at what we're sitting with right now, we have everything flattened all into one plane. We have everything aligned and correctly placed according to our plan. And we've also rotated our view in the last lesson so that we're looking at the section as we would see it on a printout. What we need to do right now is just go through each of the elements and trim and stretch and basically fix locally all of the different elements so that they start looking like a proper architectural design drawing. So one of the things I'm just going to do is start with a couple of examples. I'm not going to do the entire section because it can take quite a long time depending on how much detail you want to include, but I'm just going to run through some of the basic movements as this gets cleaned up. So I'm going to start off here by just trimming all of this that's unnecessary. You can either use the trim command or you can use the fillet command. So I'll use F for fillet. I'll select those two lines. Here I'm going to trim this line off, then I'm going to take this line and stretch it down slightly so that it's at least in line with the other bank on the other side. So now I'm going to trim this waterline across, so let's trim that away. And also you can start thinking about how this podium is going to be created in section. So perhaps you want to already change the line color so that we can have a thicker line. Let's just go and copy this across so that we can see it as a reference. I'm going to rotate it by 90 degrees as well. And let's make this all in magenta. Also, let's make sure that all of these lines here are colored not according to an odd color, but they all need to be per layer, and then we can go and add custom colors on top of that where we locally need to make any changes. So here, if you want to do any custom section, you can start drawing that in for yourself. For example, if you know that you're going to have a 2-meter edge here, perhaps it's going to have a custom profile that you want to work on. So this would be the opportunity to start drawing in all of those details. So this is where the water is going to be, as I mentioned. Here there are a couple of things where we can clean and trim as well. So let's go and basically just trim that away for ourselves. We're going to trim this line too so that that ground plane looks like it's folded. Here we're going to select all these lines and trim that as well. Similarly, we can trim the edge of the balcony and we can start deleting all of these lines so that we only have the thickness of the actual bridge as it's being done. So right now we're not necessarily showing any structure to this bridge. It's all quite simplistic for the moment, and all of that detail can now be added in once you have the opportunity to. Here, if you want to change certain lines, you can go and trim those lines away, delete what's not necessary, and basically just trim other things for yourself. Match properties, and basically this is the way it would all get done. This entrance pavilion over here will have also different line thicknesses. So everywhere where we are cutting through the ground, we can start changing this color to magenta. So let's go and change that for ourselves. Let's go make all of this in magenta. The actual slab over here, including the bridge, this should actually be in green because it's not going to be as thick as the ground, and it would be advisable to have this continuous and then just to read this as a separate slab in a different color. So let's go and do that. This is going to be green as well. And then we're going to start drawing in the elevation of that wall that is making up that pavilion. So I'm going to draw this line in here. It's going to snap onto that, and these lines will be in gray, so that will be color 8. And this is the way we basically progress. This can all be in green, and as we go along we carry on in this fashion. So here I'm going to be trimming all of this away, deleting the lines that are not necessary. All of these little pavilions are going to be in the background. They're going to be quite light, so you can even make the color a lot lighter. It doesn't have to be color 8. It can be the lightest of them all, which is color 9. So let's just choose to isolate the layer using the layer isolate, and this is why we had applied particular layers or different layers to each of those elements, because now I can just very easily isolate it, grab all of this, change it to color 9, and all of it is now changed, and I don't have to worry about the detail in the rest of it. So another thing that needs some definite editing are these columns. These columns need to actually extend all the way down. So let's go and stretch this down so that we have that continuous. And after stretching it, you can then also trim using those edges so that basically it's looking a little bit neater as well. I'm going to just delete these lines that are not necessary, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing to the other one here, where I basically stretch this down. And if you want to make the trimming a little bit easier, you can create a new polyline for yourself, which is temporary, and you can just trim from that one polyline. And we can then just select all of those lines that need to be trimmed away. And I can delete that temporary line. Another thing here, we need to just copy this horizontal line denoting this tie here, and we can copy that across to the other one. So this was just some of the details that weren't necessarily coming through when we did that flat shot command, so we can just go and manually edit it. Also remember that you can work on one of these, turn it into a block, and then copy it into this other position, because they are going to be symmetrical, they are going to be instances of each other. So using a block here could be quite helpful, but because there are only two and there are not many edits to make, I'm going to leave it as is so that I can keep moving forward quickly. Next, I'm going to make a couple of changes to this back face. What I'm going to do, I'm just also going to just hide some of the other layers so that it's a little bit easier to work with. Basically, I want to go and delete all of these diagonals so that I have only the horizontals and verticals. So basically that grid looks deformed, and this can be quite tedious if you have a very complicated mesh. So definitely do be warned that once you get into a certain level of detail, don't overdo it, because you will end up spending a lot of time where it might not be necessary. So just work very lightly, very quickly, so that you always keep within your time frame and don't harbor on the things that are not important, unless obviously they are critical to your particular type of design. So I'm not going to worry too much about this right now, but I'm just showing you how these meshes can be cleaned up, and basically you focus only on the most important elements. So some of these little edges here can also be cleaned up and redrawn. That modeling here shouldn't have had that tiny little bump, for example. So all of these little CAD things start to become very apparent, where in 3D Max we don't notice them at all. So I'm now going to go back into my actual drawing, and here we can start working on the next level, which is basically to go and obscure, trim away the things that are being hidden by something else. So the object that is most in the foreground is the central tower, and it should be hiding everything else that's happening behind it. So what I'm going to do is basically draw a polyline. I'm going to first of all choose to be working in the layer of what is going to be trimmed away. So the space frame can be the first thing. And I'm going to draw a polyline, which is going to basically be the outer extremities of this tower. Next, I'm going to do this layer by layer, and I'm going to isolate out everything on that space frame layer. Then I'm going to trim away using that polyline that I've just added for myself. I'm going to trim everything on the space frame that basically is not supposed to be there. So all of these other lines are going to now become obsolete and deleted. If you do want to keep it there for yourself, you can use something else called the wipeout, but just from trial and error, I have found it to be a little bit confusing to use, simply because you always end up having that geometry there, even though it's not necessarily visible in the printout. So sometimes that wipeout is a little bit frustrating to use, so I prefer to choose the route of actually drawing it properly and rather trimming it the way it would actually be drawn in reality. So next I'm going to isolate out this layer as well as the mesh behind it, and the same thing here. We're going to use that object to trim, and then we're going to trim everything else behind it and delete it out of our scene. There we go. So now things are starting to look a little bit neater. We still have one or two more layers to trim away, namely this one, and we can do that in the same fashion. So once this is done, you can then move on to the next section, which is basically to start adding a little bit more detail and neaten up where things are still missing. So I'm going to get to that in a moment, just as soon as I've deleted all of this. Basically what we want to do now is give a little bit more depth to what we're drawing. So namely, one of the things you want to make quite clear is a central elevator core. So we can go and convert this into a much thicker line so that we can see that we're literally cutting through it. So go ahead and make that a green line so that it is quite thick, and then you can create an offset. So enter, we can make a 300mm wall, and we can offset that inwards. And then you can choose how you want to handle this ground plane here. Perhaps you want to trim this away and leave it like so. So this would be an elevator shaft. You could then go and draw an elevator in, or copy a block of a section of an elevator. It would be a lot quicker to do that. If perhaps you want to show the entrance, if you are cutting through the entrance into this lift core, then do show that. But it is quite important to show where this lift is going to stop and how it's going to relate to all of the other elements. Sometimes as well, you may see some interpenetrating structure. So you may want to also have a look if there are things like this where you see little bits of stairs showing through that inner wall. So you may want to make a couple of local edits there as well and just neaten it up as far as you can. Remember as well that you're never going to see the drawing at this zoomed in scale. So try to always zoom out and have a look at the image as a plan or as a design drawing as you would see it on the scale that it's printed out, because there's no use in going into too much detail all the time. So I'm going to now just delete some of these lines at the back because I don't necessarily think that they are that necessary for that lift core. I prefer just seeing a nice hollow lift core. It's a lot more representative. I'm going to delete those lines here as well as these lines there. So that is pretty much it. I'm going to leave it at this. We're basically going to still continue with the section further on, but I basically wanted to show you the process until here, and you can carry on in this fashion as you go and complete the entire section.